Yeah, I think that for the nearly 300 people here, you found that there are just two ways to get here. One is to drive your automobile, and the other is to fly Southwest Airlines to Hobby Airport. An airline that was created in Texas for Texans, and now a major, not only national airline, but international airline. Mr. Ron Ricks, Vice Chairman of the Board of Southwest, the ultimate user of all of the technologies that we develop.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abramson. First, a disclaimer. I'm not a doctor. I'm not an engineer. I'm not a scientist. I am a recovering lawyer who is still trying to figure out how to edit my contacts list on my new iPhone. I am not going to stand up here today and embarrass Dr. Abramson and Dr. Hans Mark by trying to tell you what I know about technology. I'm going to tell you instead a little bit about the history of Southwest Airlines as a user of technology. What better place to begin than the beginning? What did the aviation world with respect to the airline industry look like in 1967? It looked like this. The industry was tightly regulated by a federal agency known as the United States Civil Aeronautics Board. It was a utility regulatory model. The federal government restricted the routes that could be flown. It restricted and licensed the carriers that could operate those routes. And it prohibited competition on the basis of price. You put all those together, there weren't very many airlines, there weren't very many routes, and the prices were very high. The airlines charged a price that was predicated on its cost, a utility model. Not much incentive to regulate, control, reduce your cost. As a result, airlines had high costs and high fares. As a result of the high fares, few number of flights, limited flying opportunities, a tiny minority of adult Americans in 1967 had ever been on a commercial airliner. And they weren't going to be as long as that regulatory structure remained in place. About that time, a savvy entrepreneur and a resourceful lawyer in San Antonio got together and discussed a loophole in the system. And that was that if an airline flew entirely within one state, the state of Texas, on a purely intrastate basis, it did not have to comply with the federal controls with regard to route and price regulation, i.e., it could fly where it wanted to and charge what it wanted. And that's how the idea of Southwest Airlines got born. And it got born in 1967. It did not operate its first flight until June 18, 1971, because the incumbent carriers at that time didn't take too kindly to the fact that they might have to compete against a new entrant. So those carriers at the time engaged in a political and legal plan to try to obstruct the birth of Southwest Airlines. Ultimately, a case went all the way to the United States Supreme Court on whether or not the state of Texas could issue a business license to Southwest Airlines. Now, Herb Kelleher, the co-founder of Southwest Airlines, is a lucky Irishman. And the wonderful thing about working with him is he shares the luck. In this case, the delay of almost 4 years was to our advantage. The original plan for Southwest Airlines called for the lease of 4 Lockheed Electras to start the service. Orlando, nothing against Lockheed Electras in the 1960s. A very fine 4-engine turboprop airplane with a 3-person flight deck crew, muscle manus cruised about 375 miles an hour. In the late 1960s, nobody was selling very many commercial airliners. Why? Nobody was flying. No one needed more airplanes. To the extent there was a commercial manufacturing market, there was hope that international flights with long-haul aircraft would carry the manufacturers through a recession, and the manufacturers put all their energies into the 747 at Boeing, the Lockheed L-1011, and the DC-10. Boeing had a little airplane called the 737. Nobody wanted it. It was nicknamed Fat Albert for its ungainly appearance, sitting on the ramp, and a form Boeing referred to as a whitetail. It was a whitetail because it was unpainted, because they couldn't sell it. No one wanted it. At that time, the chairman and CEO of Boeing was a man named T. Wilson. T. Wilson called Herb Kelleher at his office in San Antonio, Texas. At that time, Herb was still in his 30s. And to hear Herb Kelleher tell it, T. Wilson said, "Boy, I understand you're trying to start some pissant airline down there in Texas. I've got some airplanes here that are whitetails. I will sell them to you cheap, and I will finance them for you." Kind of like going to GMAC and buying a new pickup truck, General Motors, and getting a new pickup truck and having GMAC finance it. Herb, being a clever lawyer, quickly found a way out of those leases for the Lockheed Electras, and the plan was to start Southwest Airlines with 737s. The idea wasn't to take business away from the other airlines. There wasn't any business to take away. There were so few passengers flying, there wasn't a market share game. The idea was, by giving people enough options to fly and dramatically lowering the cost, that people would get out of their automobiles and they would travel by air. And that's what happened. But you know what? It wasn't enough. The other carriers did not like what they saw. So they engaged in a predatory pricing scheme, dropping fares within the state of Texas not only below their cost, but below Southwest Airlines' much lower cost. In a very short span of time, Southwest Airlines was down to $500 in the bank. An emergency was declared. The solution to the problem was, we have 4 airplanes. We're going to sell one to raise cash to keep going. And to make sure we don't lose any revenue, we are going to operate the same schedule with 3 that we did with 4. The only way to do that, you have to operate every flight, every day, every week with a 10-minute turn. What is a turn? From the time the plane chocks in at the gate, unload passengers, unload baggage, refuel, put peanuts and beer on the airplane, put the passengers and the baggage back on the airplane, push back in 10 minutes. Every flight, every day. And that's how Southwest Airlines reduced its cost and broke the back of its competitors, because at that level, to price below our cost at that point would have been so obvious from a predatory standpoint, it would have triggered the antitrust laws. And that was the great turnaround at Southwest Airlines. It put it on the map. The 737 made the 10-minute turn possible. Just trying to think about doing a 10-minute turn with a Lockheed Electra or other airplanes at the time, no matter how fine those airplanes might have been. It was the unprecedented reliability and dependability, keeping the airplane in the air and out of the shop, the operational efficiency of the 737 that made the 10-minute turn possible. It was a 10-minute turn that made Southwest Airlines possible. The industry took note. Aviation started to expand. The United States Congress in 1978, predicated on the model of Southwest in Texas and Pacific Southwest in California doing the same thing, deregulated the industry, allowed competition to take place, and the industry began to grow geometrically. It grew so fast, there was a backlash. People started complaining about airport noise. Too many flights. We don't want those airplanes taking off. What do? Southwest was dependent on growth, and it was dependent on access to close-in urban airports. So Southwest went back to Boeing and said, we need a new airplane. And what came out of that was a 737-300. In 1984, Southwest became the first airline in the world to operate the Stage 3 GE CFM56 powered airplane that was so quiet that it silenced the noise opponents. The rest of the industry followed suit, quickly implementing Stage 3 noise technology into their fleets, solving the airport noise crisis. It wasn't always about airplanes. You know how it works today. You go on your portable electronic device, you use an app, you buy a ticket, you pay for it using a credit card. You can print out your ticket, or you can keep the documents electronically on your device, have those scanned at the gate. It was not always that way. Once upon a time, Dr. Mark will remember, he used a hardwire telephone to call a travel agent. Travel agent called the airline, made the booking, wrote out a ticket by hand and had it delivered to you. Later on, people figured out how to computerize that process. A couple of forward-thinking airlines, not including Southwest at the time, said, well, that's a way to really corner the market. Let's acquire the computerized reservation systems, and they did. And at one point in the 1980s, the major airlines, at that time with the exception of Southwest, controlled all of the ticket distribution computerized reservation systems. Now think about it from a hacking or cybersecurity standpoint. If a travel agent wanted to issue a ticket on Southwest Airlines, it had to use, in Dallas, for example, the American Airlines Sabre system. So the American Airlines Sabre system, in order to generate a ticket on Southwest, would have access to Southwest's most proprietary information: schedule, price, customers' names. Imagine the threat. Southwest refused to play ball. We wouldn't turn over that information to them and pay the exorbitant fees that they would require to generate a ticket through a travel agent on Southwest Airlines. In a miraculous coincidence, on the same day and exactly the same hour, all the computerized reservation systems locked Southwest out of their systems. You couldn't generate a ticket. The travel agent couldn't generate a ticket. If a travel agent couldn't generate a ticket on Southwest, Southwest couldn't sell any tickets to passengers. What did Southwest do? First, we went a low-tech way. We literally mailed tickets to customers and used overnight courier services, but obviously that's not a long-term solution. A young marketing guy came into the senior management committee and said, you know, there's this thing called the World Wide Web. And we said, what's that? And he said, it's amazing. You go on your computer. I think we can fix this in such a way we can have this thing called a web page, and people can actually use it to buy tickets. So we said, let's do that. 1996, Southwest Airlines was the first major airline to go to the internet as a primary means of ticket distribution. And the rest, you might say, is history. Today, well north of 90% of bookings are made on the internet, and almost all the sales and payments are made via the internet. And from 1996 to 2003, Southwest went from being almost unable to distribute its tickets to being the largest carrier on an originating passenger basis in the United States of America, a multi-year head start on the other airlines in terms of internet usage, and at one point being one of the major sellers of anything on the internet. Then came the oil crisis. Oil prices went way up. What do? We can't afford to fly anymore. The oil prices are too high. Back to Boeing we go. After improving the 737-300 by launching the 737-500 and 700, we got together with Boeing and GE and launched the 737 MAX, put into service in the fourth quarter of 2017, just this past year. That ought to carry Southwest well into the future. The next technology frontier in terms of Southwest Airlines, air traffic control modernization. Orlando, Lockheed has to help us solve the air traffic control problem, because otherwise, when your hypersonic airplane hits U.S. airspace, it's going to slow down to the speed of a DC-6. So, what's the problem? The air traffic control system today is the biggest cause of expense, unnecessary expense, biggest cause of delays, biggest cause of customer inconvenience and employee frustration. If anybody's here for the FAA, that's not to criticize the FAA. It is the operating or governance system that the FAA has to operate in, particularly oversight by Congress. Southwest Airlines is leading an industry initiative to, quote, privatize, create a quasi-private corporation funded by user fees to modernize the air traffic control system. Tremendous opportunity for technology there. What's the pattern here? Southwest Airlines is a user, we're not a developer. There's nothing that focuses the creative energies of an organizational entity like the threat of extinction. It is then that we go to new technology. We're not the developer. Technology is a tool. Ancient philosophers, prior to the development of written language, had an expression. It was called acoustic renown. What they meant was When you're gone, would poets recite verse about you? Would singers sing songs about you? Would storytellers tell stories about your exploits? Acoustic renown, today we might call that legacy. Legacy for a successful organization today is not the development of new technology. It's how you use the technology to do things for people. Customers, employees, business partners, and yes, sometimes even competitors. This is a very educated, erudite, experienced, sophisticated audience. A lot of you have backgrounds in academia. Perhaps you will appreciate my own pedagogical story. It relates to an elementary school that forces students to watch a 45-minute documentary film on ancient Greece. At the end of the documentary, the students were asked to try and remember 3 things that they took away from the documentary. The first little girl to raise her hand said, Socrates was an ancient Greek. He talked too much. They poisoned him. Thank you.
I hope you all enjoyed as much as I did hearing about how those technologies were incorporated to make such a successful business venture. You're good. Questions for Mr. Anybody? Questions? Okay, Mr. Ricks, thank you very much for a most interesting talk. And thanks to all of our folks here. And we have a few minutes. If there are any questions that have occurred to anybody for any member of our group here, we'd be happy to entertain those. Any questions anybody would like to offer?
I want to ask a question. So where did open seating come into the Southwest building?
Is my mic still on?
Yes.
Open seating came into the story really as part of the 10-minute turn. In terms of, we found that it was just faster to get people on and off the airplane, and still is today. It's all about speed.
Very good. Anyone else? Okay. We're a little bit early, so I'm going to suggest that we take our recess now and reconvene at 4 o'clock, at which time we'll look at some of the research activities that are going on and how they relate to the commercial ventures that you've been hearing about in this first half. So I want to thank our panel very much for facing the challenges that I gave to them on looking at their business, at research, and at their workforce. Thank you very much to all of you.